So it's kind of timely today that we are continuing our series on service and reaching out. And the person, every now and then when we do a series, I like to talk about a person who exemplifies the principles we're talking about. So today, what I'm going to talk about is the Dalai Lama, who you just saw and heard. And I encourage you to go to that website. It's www.joinaforceforgood.org. Because they have more videos and they have ways you can join and they have different things that you can do. So we'll talk about that more a little bit later. But what I want to focus on right now is a little bit about His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He is truly a citizen of the world. He lives in exile. He has done little for the last 50 years but travel around and spread the message of compassion and peace and love and hope. His face is known everywhere, and his life has just been an inspiration to millions, probably including some of you. I know Tom was mentioning that he, and I think Chris, had gone to hear the Dalai Lama speak at one point, and I know others have as well. So in July of 2015, he turned, I'm watching the clock because I'm not going to go long, but in July of 2015, he turned 80. And a few months before he turned 80, his English translator, a guy named Thutpen Jinpa, called his friend, the author and psychologist Daniel Goleman, and said, will you write a book for His Holiness's 80th birthday? And Goleman said yes, he would. And the reason that the translator called is because as he turned 80, the Dalai Lama wanted to leave a message. He wanted to leave his thoughts and his message of how humanity needs to move forward in the centuries to come, in the generations and the centuries to come, so that we can have, and our posterity can have, a kinder and more compassionate world. He says, I'm 80. It's time for me to put this stuff down, so that when I am not here, the citizens of the world will know it. The result is the book, A Force for Good, the Dalai Lama's vision for our world. And the way it was written is Daniel Goleman just spent hours talking to him and getting his stories and getting his wisdom and writing it up and just giving it to us. He didn't take any money for it. He donated all the proceeds to the Dalai Lama Trust or various other charities in furtherance of the Dalai Lama's work. So before I get into that, let me tell you a little bit about the Dalai Lama, only because you may not know a whole lot about him, but this stuff is way cool. Okay, so the title Dalai Lama means ocean of wisdom. Who knew that? I didn't know that. It means ocean of wisdom. So each Dalai Lama is believed to be a manifestation or a reincarnation of the Bodhisattva of compassion. And as we know from our discussions of Buddhism, the Bodhisattva is an enlightened being who decides to forego nirvana for the moment and come back to this earthly plane to teach wisdom to those of us who are still here. That is a bodhisattva. And the 14th Dalai Lama, because he is the 14th in the line, is the reincarnation of that bodhisattva. His name is Tenzin Gyatso, but I also found out that Tibetans don't call him the Dalai Lama. They call him simply Kundun, or the presence. How cool is that? The presence of the bodhisattva of compassion. So, okay, I'm going to tell you briefly how Tenzin Gyatso came to be the 14th Dalai Lama, because I find this fascinating. So remember that he is the reincarnation, the 14th reincarnation of the original Bodhisattva of compassion, and so this is how he is. Identified. Tenzin Gyatso was born with the name Lamo Dondra to a family of peasant farmers in a small town in northeastern Tibet. The town was called Taxter, and his parents were basically illiterate farmers. He had 15 siblings, 6 of whom, plus him, survived to adulthood. So in December of 1933, the 13th Dalai Lama died. So traditionally, after a Dalai Lama dies, a search is initiated for his reincarnation. High Lamas, as well as officials of the Tibetan government, search for a boy born in Tibet who is born about the same time as the prior Dalai Lama dies. Now, there have been several ways that the lamas are told who this boy may be or where he may be. The High Lama may have a dream. Sometimes if the Dalai Lama is cremated and his ashes are, when he's burned, they will see in the direction the smoke floats for a direction in which they must look. Or they will visit a place called the Oracle Lake, and the Lama will wait to have a vision or a dream as to where he might look. So the High Lama will go to a lake called Lama Lotso in central Tibet and watch for a sign from the lake itself. So in the case of the current Dalai Lama, the High Lama did that. He went to the Oracle Lake and he had a vision. He had a vision of a monastery with a gold and turquoise roof, and near it was a home with unusual gutters. In addition, another sign was that the embalmed face of the 13th Dalai Lama reportedly turned in the direction of the northeast. And so these were signs that that is where they needed to look. Does anybody know this? I mean, isn't this interesting? This is fascinating. So that was a sign as to where they needed to look. So they went to the area in which the village of Tokster was located, and they found the monastery, a 3-story monastery with that roof, and they searched the nearby villages, and they found a house with unusual gutters, and they observed a family and a small boy. So they stood there and they just observed him and went away. Now they were dressed as peasants. They were not dressed in their religious robes. They never disclosed that they were High Lamas or that they were looking for the next Dalai Lama. They then went back in a couple days and they formally tested him. Again, they did not tell him what they were doing. They didn't tell his family what they were doing. They went in and they had some objects that belonged to the deceased Dalai Lama. And they showed them to the boy, and he immediately pointed to those items, specifically a mala or beads, which belonged to the 13th Dalai Lama, and he said, "It's mine, it's mine." And some other items that they had. In addition, he was sitting on the lap of the highest Dalai Lama, who he picked out without knowing that he was the highest Dalai Lama, and he called him Lama Sira, which he didn't know, but that was his title and the monastery that he was from. And so, given this and a few other tests, they identified Lama Dondru as the 14th reincarnation of the Bodhisattva of compassion, and they identified him as the next Dalai Lama. So what happened is at the age of 5, he began his education in a local monastery and also with some monks in the Tibetan capital of Lhasa. He was enthroned at the age of 15 in Lhasa at the massive Potala Palace. If you get on the internet, you can see pictures of this palace. But it's a huge palace that is built into the side of a mountain. Tibet is obviously quite mountainous. And so he was living there and was enthroned there in 1959, which was when he turned, 1950, when he turned 15. Now, for the previous 400 years in which there had been Dalai Lamas, none of them had traveled outside Tibet. Their duties had been largely ceremonial. They were the secular head of Tibet, and they were the religious head of Tibetan Buddhism, but they were largely unknown to the outside world. They stayed there and they performed ceremonial duties. However, in 1950, China invaded Tibet. Since 1913, the Chinese had seen Tibet really as a province of China, and so in 1950, they invaded Tibet. In 1951, the Tibetans signed what they call a 17-point pact with the Chinese that recognized Chinese sovereignty, but it also guaranteed Tibetan autonomy under the sovereignty of the Dalai Lama. The problem was that the communist Chinese really stayed there in Lhasa, and they really did not permit full autonomy for the Tibetans. So in 1959, Tibetans in Lhasa revolted. They declared the Chinese out. They said they wanted the Dalai Lama to be the sole sovereign of Tibet. The Chinese army moved in and just crushed them. And the word was that they were going to assassinate the Dalai Lama. So he hid, and with many retainers, he fled into India at night for over a course of days. And the Indians took him in. It was Nehru who took him in. And they permitted him to form a government in exile and live in Dharamsala, where he still lives. He has never returned to Tibet, and most likely never will. But what he has done is he has preserved Tibetan language, Tibetan culture in India. And he and the thousands of followers who went with him remain in that part of India. Now, Tenzin Gyatso also says that the search for the next Dalai Lama will not be the same. He says if he is reborn, and he's not sure he's going to be, but he says if he is reborn, he is not going to be reborn in any area that's run by the People's Republic of China or in any area that's not free. It's interesting, he also says that maybe there's no need for future Dalai Lamas, or that maybe the next Dalai Lama will just be the community. He doesn't know. He has said before he dies he's going to meet with a group of religious leaders and just basically tell them whether he's going to be reborn or not, and in what figure that will take. He's also said that he might be reborn as an insect. He says, I'll be reborn as whatever serves all sentient beings. So, I don't know, we'll have to see what happens with that. So, it's 1959. He's 24 years old. He's exiled from his country in a strange land. He is spiritual and temporal head of the Tibetan government in exile. So, he was at a choice point. I mean, no Dalai Lama had ever been even outside the country. And here's this 24-year-old who had to figure out how to spend his remaining years in a useful and a way that fulfilled who he was here to be. So he has continued to work for Tibetan autonomy unsuccessfully. And as the Bodhisattva of compassion, he has dedicated himself for humanitarian work for all the world's citizens. He's become a global voice for compassion and kindness and peace and tolerance. He's written books. He's traveled the world spreading the message of peace. In 1989, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his nonviolent approach to the conflict with China, and also about his work for environmental sustainability. He tirelessly teaches and speaks about the need for all people to live together. The thing about the Dalai Lama, if you read anything about him, he truly has a very different paradigm for seeing people. We've all seen situations where there are people of power and there are people of lesser power, and the people of power typically act like, I'm a person of power, I don't need to pay attention to you, I'm important and you're not. The Dalai Lama's vision of humanity is that we are all one, and it's not only something he teaches, it's something he profoundly believes. They tell the story of in 1998, he went to meet with former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, and he's walking up the stairs of the palace where they were going to meet, and there is a guard standing over to the side, like those Buckingham Palace guards, just kind of standing there. And so he's going up the stairs with Gorbachev, and he stops and goes over to this guy and shakes his hand and talks to him. I mean, who does that? But he saw that guard as just as important and just as deserving of his attention as Gorbachev. The guard was later interviewed, and he said in 25 years he's been standing there, nobody has even noticed he existed until the Dalai Lama went over and greeted him. That's how he operates. He has genuine interest in and compassion in and delight in every human soul he meets, regardless of their power, what they do. The story's told that he was backstage for an interview once, and there are all these luminaries wandering around, and the Dalai Lama goes over and talks to the stagehand with interest and delight and enjoyment and like, tell me about yourself. He's an amazing guy. So in this book, we ask ourselves, what is his message for us now as he turns 80? I mean, what does he want to leave for us now? This is his message, is that the world needs each of us individually, to realize that we can be a force for good. Look at that video. Look at the little things those guys did. Nothing anybody did in that video was a global game changer, but each one of them was a force to improve the world around him or her. Each one of them was a force for good. He says the transformation of our world will only begin with the transformation of each one of us, starting in our hearts. That's the first part. The second part, he also says, is that we need to start. We need to start now, because it's going to take a long time, and it's not going to get started until we do. So the other thing the Dalai Lama realized is that even though he is a religious leader, his message is not religious, because he knows that now there are millions of people on the planet who do not follow any religion, who may not believe in God. So instead of, he says, I don't want to keep giving the same message to all those Buddhists. He says, I want to talk to the 7 billion people on the planet, 1 billion of whom are not believers. He wants to talk to them whether they believe in God or not. He knows that religion does not have a monopoly on ethics, on morality, such as principles such as kindness or compassion. Remember 2 weeks ago, I talked about that great pool of human consciousness that we can throw kindness into as an antidote to violence and fear. That is what he envisions. He envisions all of us individually acting and collectively having an effect as an antidote to the problems of today's world, what he calls a force for good. You know, it's interesting because as you look just at the teachings over the years, when you're thinking about Eastern religions, you think so much about individual awakening, about focusing on yourself and bringing yourself toward enlightenment. It seems to me that this Dalai Lama in this time has gone beyond that. And instead of looking for individual awakening only, is summoning up a move toward global awakening, a global enlightenment that will lead humanity forward into a better future. As I was doing research for this talk and other talks, I came across a concept called the Great Turning. Has anyone heard of the Great Turning? It is a time in which we move from an industrial age or a post-industrial age toward a future of sustainability and community and connection. That is where we as a global consciousness just turn and begin a new future. And that is what this Dalai Lama is urging us to do. A universal awakening done by each of us individually. A collective enlightenment. So how do we get there? The first thing we do, he says, is what he said in this video, is transform our minds. Remember how I talked about Roger Walsh in his book, Essential Spirituality, about how every religion, basically, their goal is to teach us to train our minds? That's what he's talking about. He says we need to learn to train our minds, what he calls emotional hygiene, to turn away from those destructive emotions, anger, fear, and turn into the good emotions, the beneficial emotions that lead us toward compassion. Compassion toward all. Now the other thing he says, which I think is interesting, is he bases this on science. One of the interesting facts about the Dalai Lama, he says if he hadn't been a monk, he probably would have been an engineer. When he was young, they had 2 cars in Lhasa, and they were carried over the Himalayas part by porters. Okay, so they had these 2 cars in the capital city, and he took them apart and put them back together again. He just loves tinkering with stuff. And so he has a very scientific approach, and he says the benefits of compassion are based on science, because we are biologically wired to feel good when we serve others, when we love others, when we give to others. They call it a helper's high. Has anybody heard that phrase? We just feel good. And this goes back as early as 3 months of age. There are experiments where they can prove that 3-month-old babies prefer acts of kindness over acts of violence or cruelty. It's just our innate wiring. So he says the first thing we do is we develop a calm mind. And it's not a comatose mind. It's not a mind that's just asleep. It's what he calls a lucid mind combined with a warm heart. A mind that does not let destructive emotions run away with us, because when they do, we are in the grip of those emotions and we can't access the compassion that is in our beings, that is in our hearts. He says only with a calm mind can you open your heart and use your mind well. What he's doing is really the marriage of science and spirituality. He uses Eastern meditation techniques and Eastern awakening techniques to get us to the place where our innate wiring can come out, where our compassion can make a difference. He worked with a psychologist, Jerome Kagan, who said, although humans inherit a biological bias that permits them to feel anger, jealousy, selfishness, envy, and to be rude, aggressive, or violent, we inherit an even stronger biological basis for kindness, compassion, cooperation, love, and nurture, especially toward those in need. He says the innate ethical compass is a biological feature of our species. The Dalai Lama also teaches that the first person to benefit from a sense of compassion is yourself. Remember how I earlier said you can't give away something you don't have? Our hearts open up to compassion, to love, before we can give it away. The first person to whom we must feel compassionate is ourselves. So here's what he means when he talks about compassion. You know, sometimes when we think about compassion, we think about just kind of being nice and feeling sorry for people and not being mean. He calls for something called a muscular compassion. I mean, this guy is not kidding. He calls for us to get up and move out. Muscular compassion is acting to better society, to help the oppressed, to make it a better world, using compassion as our North Star. The first thing he talked about when he talked about muscular compassion was public corruption. Seriously. I mean, this guy's not kidding. And why? Because public corruption, corruption in government, cronyism, favoritism, what it does is it robs people of the opportunity to move forward. It eliminates the chance for all of us to be treated equally. It leaves some people out. And that is not a compassionate way to live. It's not a compassionate way to conduct our society. This kind of reminds me of the liberation theology we talked about a while back, the belief that Spirit intends us to work for a society in which all are raised up. Not just give somebody $5 and call it a day. Work for a global society where all are treated with respect and equality and honor. That is what he's talking about. And he says the basis for that is the expression of compassion. The driving force is compassion. He calls for moral responsibility in all areas of public life. He says the applicable principles are fairness, transparency, and accountability. He looks for us to be compassionate, to treat well those who are at the furthest center, the furthest away from the center of power. One of the Dalai Lama's inspiration is Gandhi, even though he never met him. And he liked a quote that was found by Gandhi found around Gandhi's notes when he died in 1948. And the quote is, "Recall the face of the poorest and the weakest man whom you may have seen, and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to him." Now that's a good kind of lodestar, isn't it? Ask yourself if what you're going to do is going to be of any use to him. So that's muscular compassion in terms of social responsibility. It's not just walking around feeling good, I'm a compassionate person. It's getting up and being compassionate. He also talks about economic compassion. And there he talks about income inequality. I mean, this guy is not kidding. He talks about income inequality as being totally immoral. It's hard for us to envision because here in the West, we have this attitude about wealth and about income. When I was in the legal world, we call it you eat what you kill. So you get to keep whatever you earn. You get to keep whatever comes your way. His paradigm is so different. His paradigm is one of global unity, global harmony, all of us taking care of each other. He thinks it's immoral. He says of billionaires, he's confused. He says, why do billionaires need all that money? They only have one stomach. And his view is if you have it, share it, because that is what compassion would do. He also notes, again, back to science, that studies show, or surveys show, that the greater contentment is found in societies where income inequality is at its least. And he talks about societies like Sweden and Denmark that, yes, have very high rates of taxation, but they also have wonderful support systems for everybody. You're not going to find people living in desperate poverty. You may not find people living in great wealth, but everybody is okay. Everybody is doing okay, and folks are taken care of. He says wealth is for the good of society, not a single individual. He says capitalism, as we practice it, can be cruel and indifferent to the poor. He calls for ethical, moral, compassionate businesses. Actually, one of them he points out is a company called Grayston Bakery in Yonkers, New York. They make chocolate that goes to Ben & Jerry's ice cream, for example. They employ ex-offenders. They employ the homeless. They employ anybody who has difficulty getting a job. And their company's motto is, we don't hire people to bake brownies, we bake brownies to hire people. Isn't that great? I mean, that's what they do. Their business is a social outreach. He also talks about B corporations. Has anybody heard of a B corporation? I frankly had not. A B corporation is a for-profit company certified by the nonprofit B Lab that meets standards of social and environmental performance and transparency. And it's a corporation that is not designed just to make money, come hell or high water. It's designed to improve the lives of those that it touches. And it's a specific corporate form. They help people become self-sufficient and work to better themselves. He's not talking about charity, he's talking about opportunity, because that gives people self-respect, esteem, and the tools to continue to move forward. The Dalai Lama also talks about compassion for the earth. He went to a seminar a few years ago at MIT, and the guy who was speaking said, at the height of the last ice age, when glaciers covered much of North America, there was a sheet of ice about a mile high where we sit right now. Think about that. And the sea levels were about 400 feet lower. The Earth's temperature during that ice age averaged 9 degrees Fahrenheit colder than it is now. By 2100, the Earth's temperature is going to average 9 degrees warmer if we stay on our present course. And where does this lead us? We've talked about this before. This talks of increased ocean acidity, increased climatic turbulence, the reduction of biodiversity, massive impacts on humans and on non-human species. So he talks about the need to take care of our home, because we are stewards of it for future generations. So that is his theory of compassion for the earth. What can we do, even as individuals, to take care of our home? He says sometimes when we think about what we can do, we feel that we can't do anything because it's just us. What can I do? Okay, my wife and I have gone down to one car. Is that going to save the oceans? No, I don't think so. But it's an individual action that does something. He came across a study by a lady named Elke Weber, who decided that when people think about what they can do individually, they just get depressed. When we think about our footprint, our ecological footprint, we think there's nothing we can do. So she came up with the notion of what is our handprint. Look at your little hand. What can your hand do to make your environment better? You can turn off lights. You can not take baths because it uses so much more water. There are things we can do just ourselves. And if you do it alone, will it make a difference? No. But if people do it together, will it make a difference? Yes. So that is how we measure what she calls our handprint. Look at the resources we save. So what the Dalai Lama is telling us to do here, he's not claiming to have specifics on how to solve all these problems. He's talking about how we show up. He's talking about the qualities we bring to our lives to make a difference. I kind of think of St. Augustine's instruction, remember, love and do what you will. What the Dalai Lama is telling us to do is be compassionate and go where it takes you. Because he doesn't have the specifics. That's up to us. That's up to all of us. Be compassionate and just do what you will. He talks about the qualities that we have to bring to our lives. Now, he's an optimist. He's a futurist. What he says is, we look at the news, and it's also depressing. I know people who don't even listen to the news anymore because it's so depressing. It just gets this toxic energy into them. But what he says is, look at the world. It's gotten so much better, even though there are problems. He says, if you take in one hand all the violence and all the fear and all the hurt that is done in 1 year, all around the world, and put it here, and then you take in the other hand all the acts of kindness and love, even small, mothers making sandwiches, teachers teaching class, people supporting each other, nurses and doctors healing, and you put it in that hand, this hand so outweighs this hand. We just don't see it because we look at the news and we know that if it bleeds, it leads. So we have this image that the world is such a terrible, dark, horrible place. And there are things that need to be fixed, there's no doubt. But we also need to keep in mind the effort that is being put forward by millions to make it so much better, and it is working. If you just look at our human progress in the last 200 years, in terms of child poverty, in terms of world hunger, in terms of world health, our progress has been amazing. That's the curve he wants to keep going. And he wants us to recognize that our efforts make a difference. He gives a picture of hope. See, the thing about fear, if that's where we focus, fear fixes us in the problem. It just keeps us focused on the problem. I think Goleman says that Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech was, I have a dream, not I just had a nightmare. We have to focus on hope. That's what gets people hooked in, because that's where we put our joy, is what is coming next, what we can do next. He takes the long view. He says, it's not going to happen now. It's not going to be something even we see. He's speaking to a younger generation and saying, maybe you won't even see it. He's talking about centuries. He's talking about generations. He urges us to take the long view. But he also says that what we do now makes a difference in the long view. We have to start. You know what they say, the guy who plants an oak tree doesn't see the tree? But if he didn't, there wouldn't be a tree. We just have to start. He tells us to cultivate a warm heart and human values. Start where you are, doing what you can. Join a force for good. I think we should just all go to that website and just take a look. Because little things that we do today that might turn into big things, like Fiona, who knows, make a difference now and in the years to come. So let's take these thoughts into meditation.